Hey, Herberters! Like a bunch of mentats on the back of a sandworm, we are beaming straight to your ear hole. The Dickheads podcast presents Dick Adjacent 60s Hugo Winners series is rolling on with one of the all-time classics of science fiction, Dune by Frank Herbert. So we have a couple guest dickheads to join us tonight. My name is David Agranoff. I am one of your usual co-hosts of the Dickheads podcast. Joining us tonight, first is Marissa Van Uden, who is a manuscript editor who works mostly with science fiction, fantasy, and nonfiction writers. She's been doing this for a long time, I think over a decade. But some of you might know her voice from the SFF audio podcast. And she's a big dickhead as well, and they're covering many of Philip K. Dick's short stories with read-alongs on there. So welcome to the show, Marissa.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yes, I'm very excited to have you here. I've been wanting to get you on the podcast for a long time, and I'm sure we'll have you for a regular PKD episode at some point. But you're originally from New Zealand and living in Los Angeles, so just right up the road from us, and we're really stoked to have you. Also, to join us today is Michael Moore, and he is from Richmond, Virginia. He's a teacher of French and Spanish, and he has a master in multilingual studies, and got his bachelor from VCU, but he's here because he is a giant, enormous Dune fan and super knowledgeable Dune dork. And when I put the word out on the internet, who's the biggest Dune dork I could possibly recruit for this episode, many people told me I needed to talk to Michael Moore. So, Michael, welcome to the Dickheads podcast.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So, we are talking about the 1966 winner, co-winner of the Hugo Awards, because Dune actually tied the year that it won. It did not win outright, so we'll talk about the other nominees. But the Toastmaster in 1966 was one Sir Isaac Asimov. Well, he's not a sir, but Isaac Asimov. And this award was given at Tricon in Cleveland, Ohio. As Howard the Duck would say, Cleveland. And it was September 1st through the 5th of 1966. So Frank Herbert had to trudge his way up to Cleveland to pick up his Hugo. Yeah, he had to go to Cleveland. So the other nominees that year were, obviously Dune. And this was the second time Dune was nominated. The first part of Dune was nominated as a novella called Dune World for its first magazine appearance. And I believe it was just the first part of Dune, but I could be wrong about that. One of the other books was This Immortal by Roger Zelazny. This is the book that Dune shares the award with. And we will be doing a separate Roger Zelazny episode with both of his two 60s winners, This Immortal and Lord of Light, at another date. Also nominated were Squares of the City by John Brunner, who, of course, we did an episode on Brunner's 1969 winner, Stand on Zanzibar, and we're big fans of Brunner here. Also nominated that year was Moon is the Heart's Mistress, the first serialized version of Moon is the Heart's Mistress, not the complete novel. And then the last nominee was a book, and I'm going to butcher the title, but it was Skylark du Quinze by Edward E. Smith. Now, this is a classic space opera, like Flash Gordon style novella or serialized novel from the 30s that was reprinted. And from what I read, a lot of people thought that this book was going to get some kind of legacy award thing because it was a huge influence on a lot of the older voters, but it did not win, of course. But it's interesting because I had never heard of that one. So, but apparently this was a very Flash Gordon style series. So, of the other books, I mean, this is a really strong category. I don't know. Has anybody else read any of the other books in this category this year?
No.
Nope.
I think only Moon is a Harsh Mistress. I think that's the only one I recognized from that list.
Yeah, and we already recorded our Moon is a Heart's Mistress episode, but I think between that, and I know the fact that This Immortal won, it just seems like it was a really strong category that year. This seems like a really strong category this year. It's not like certain years where we had like, I know with when Way Station won, I was just flabbergasted that it lost, or that it beat Cat's Cradle, but I don't think there's anything in here that necessarily that I'm like, wow, Dune shouldn't have won. I think Dune is clearly the ultimate classic in here, and it's more surprising that it tied at all that year. But even so, I would say Dune is probably a much stronger book than Moon is a Heart's Mistress, which would go on to win in the next year, and I would I'd say that it does deserve to be a winner of the Hugo, and certainly we wouldn't all be here talking about it if we didn't think that it didn't deserve to win. I'm sorry, I jumped a little bit ahead, but why don't we all talk a little bit about our history with reading Dune? Let's start with Marissa. When did you first read Dune?
I think I feel like I was like 12 or 13 or something like that. Like pretty young, and I read it and loved it. I've heard that a lot of kids don't like reading it, and I didn't understand why until I reread it as an adult, and I'm like, oh yeah, there's so much complicated shit in there. But as a kid, I just skated through it reading the mother-son story, like all the desert camping and the cool sandworms, and yeah, I fell in love with it.
Yeah, so, and how many times have you read Dune yourself?
I'm actually not sure. I read it pretty regularly. Probably like maybe 5 or 6 times.
Okay, I am on my 3rd time. I also read Dune first when I was probably in 8th grade, and I definitely didn't get all of it, of course, but I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And I'm actually, for those of you watching on the YouTubes, this is the copy that I originally read when it was brand new, and it's all beaten, battered, and worn.
Wow.
And this copy was the one that my father bought me when I was in 8th grade. And I don't think he knew what it was. I knew that there was a movie, and I hadn't seen the movie yet, but that's one of the reasons why I was like, oh, I want to get this. And I had heard that it was a huge influence on Star Wars. And I was, of course, a Star Wars geek, so I definitely wanted to read that. Michael, what is your history? When did you first read Dune?
Like when I was like 14 and a half, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So my uncle was coming into town for the sole purpose of watching the Dune miniseries on Sci-Fi Channel at my grandma's house for some reason. And he's like, hey, do you want to watch it? And so I watched it, and I was like, that's cool. And he had a copy of the book with him, and he handed that to me. I read like the first 14 pages. It's the black version, with the sand on the front. And I read those first 14 pages. I'm like, this is impossible. This is too hard for me to read. So then I went to the book exchange place right up the street from us, and I got all of his like smaller works that were there, like Whipping Star, Decided Experiment, Isa Heisenberg, Green Brain, all the Santa Rogabaria. And I read those, and it was just boom, 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 boom. And I was like, I guess I'll return to Dune. And it was accelerated reader points for my school, too, which was like kudos on me. So I was like, oh, yeah, I'm going to read all of them. They're like 40 points apiece. And so then I read them all through.
Wow, so you actually read Herbert's other work before really diving into Dune, because most people have just read Dune. I think I read...
That's really serious, too. Like, at 14, you went and did that? Like,
going
to go get all the short stories and figure this guy out before I dive into his novel?
Right.
Well, it was more like Dune was too hard for me, so I had to go do his smaller books to feel comfortable and then come back.
But you were, like, dedicated to the mission. You were like, I'm going to read it. I'm going to build up to it.
Yeah, since then I can say that, yes.
Well, that's cool. And how many times do you think you've read Dune overall, Mike?
Dune itself I've only read twice.
Mm-hmm. But you've read, I take it you've just dived deeply into all the other cursory stuff. And you've read the whole series, too. We've all read the whole, like, original series, correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Oh no, I haven't.
Oh, you haven't
So
read all the way
I
through.
reread the first book regularly because I love it. Like, I only just read Dune Messiah. I'm not even finished it yet because we were doing this podcast. I was like, I should finally read the sequel.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I have reread the original Dune 3 times. I have read the entire series twice through
Wow.
Herbert's 5 books or whatever it is.
Yep.
And I'm one of the weirdos who actually likes Children of Dune is my favorite of the series. But I'm jumping ahead. But let's talk about the writing and publication history of this awesome classic, and then we'll get into all the things we love and don't love, or how we feel about the book. Now, as far as the writing and publication history, the original inspiration came as early as 1957 during a trip to the dunes in Oregon on the coast, and Frank Herbert was given this assignment to basically research how they were dealing with land erosion on the beach. And when he saw how they were controlling or manipulating the ecosystem, you can kind of see where his brain started going and his interest in ecology. Now, when people talk about this book as being purely space fantasy, it's always important to note that the original inspiration for the book was a purely scientific venture and thinking for ecology. But anyways, he outlined and wrote the first 3 books together, all the way through Children of Dune, were all outlined as one project. He saw them as one big novel in his mind in the beginning. And if you look at the arc that goes through the first 3 books, the arc through Children of Dune is much more, it seems much more clear and more thought out than when you get into the other weirder stuff in the books after that. And so for me, when I read that he outlined the first 3 together, it made a lot of sense as a writer that that's the way he was doing it. Dune was...
I think if I'd known that earlier, I would definitely have read all 3 of them. I've been so scared of the sequels.
Yeah, I don't think you should be scared of... the problem with Dune Messiah that most people have is that that's kind of the slow one. So
Well, I'm like 75% through and like totally digging it so far, so I think I'll be good for the next one.
Yeah. I think you'll definitely enjoy it. But, it does get into weirder stuff after that, but those first 3 is, because a lot of people say that they think that once Herbert kind of got a little bit of success with it, that he tried to put too much into it. But if you consider that the first 3 books were kind of devised together, I think there's a purity of those first 3 books of the concept. Now, it was first published in Analog magazine in 2 serialized stories, Dune World and Prophet of Dune. And we already mentioned that Dune World was nominated for the Hugo in the year that it was originally published in Analog. And it is interesting to note with Analog that the editor was John W. Campbell, and we'll get into more details about that. John W. Campbell, of course, is a controversial figure in science fiction in 2019, but at the time when he was publishing Dune and Analog, he was absolutely one of the cornerstones of the genre. So it was a huge deal for John W. Campbell to accept and publish Dune. That being said, once they published it as a serial, they immediately were trying to get it published in hardcover, and it was rejected by over 20 publishers before his editor finally got a hold of Sterling Lanier, who is an editor at Chilton Books, and he was a big science fiction reader and had read Dune World and Analog and was a huge fan of it, and he wanted to publish it with Chilton Books. Here's the only problem. Chilton Books publishes automotive manuals, right? They don't do fiction, and they definitely don't do science fiction. But Chilton Books editor, this Sterling Lanier guy, was such a huge science fiction fan and loved Dune. He convinced the owners of the company that they had, that all these publishers had rejected it. They don't know what they have, and we're going to publish this, and it's going to be this great big deal.
What a legend.
Yeah. Here's the problem. It didn't sell well for Chilton Books.
But he knew. He had a vision.
He did have a vision, but it had a $5.95 price tag, which roughly adjusted for our times, that would be about $45.
Wow.
For a hardcover. It was not cheap. And it definitely did not sell well at first. So much so that our boy Sterling got fired for publishing Dune. He lost his job at Chilton Books. And
that is the saddest freaking story.
yes. Now here's the thing. It quickly got nominated for Hugo, and once Ace in 1965, later in the year, bought the paperback rights, just the fact that Ace had made this move and the nomination happened, then the book started selling. Here's the thing. Sterling already lost his job. He had already been fired for taking on Dune. And we do know also that Don Wollheim, who is the editor at Ace, who our Dickheads listeners are very familiar with because he published almost all of Philip K. Dick's early work. And he's somebody we talk about all the time. We talk about Don Wollheim constantly on the Dickheads podcast because he constantly was changing titles for PKD, and usually he was making the right choice. Usually PKD had these really stupid titles. Well, he apparently had tried to convince Herbert to change the title of Dune because he was afraid people would think it was a Western, right? And Ace did publish Westerns. But because it had already gotten nominated and so on, he kind of let that go. Nonetheless, Don Wollheim did eventually publish it, and we have the book that we eventually grew to know as a classic. So now we have Dune. There are some interesting quotes from especially John W. Campbell, and one of the really funny things was that John W. Campbell's first note to Frank Herbert was, "Congratulations, you have a 15-year-old Superman novel." And if people know that John Campbell wanted psychic teenager stories and superhuman characters was like a big thing with him. And so it was funny because all John W. Campbell saw when he first got Dune was that Paul Atreides was like a superhuman character. He didn't see any of the other aspects of it. He just saw, congratulations, you have this this superhero character. And he also, I know, his editor also had gotten a letter, and this is really funny, on May 25th, 1963, so this is close to 2 years before it was published as a novel. He said, "Dear Frank, I had a call from John Campbell this morning. He's interested in Dune, and I'm seeing him on Monday to hear what he has to say. The original copy went to him last week. I had corrected all the pages, deleting, adding, substituting certain pages. In places where 1.5 to a dozen words had been substituted, the old lines were X'd out and the new words were typed over in pen. But here are 7 pages to retype." And so the reason why I mention this is really interesting is just how heavily involved in the editing process John Campbell was originally. And I found the exact quote. He said, concerning the leading character, Campbell wrote, "Congratulations, you are now the father of a 15-year-old Superman." If Dune is to be the first of 3, and you're planning to use Paul in the future ones, oh man, you've set yourself up with a problem. You might want to make the next one somewhat more plottable if you didn't give Paul quite so much of the super duper.
Less of the super duper.
Little less of the super duper. Little did he know that he had already planned to take away his super duper. And I noticed too that, and this all comes from. There's a book, and I'm holding it up here for your YouTubers, called Road to Dune, which is credited to Frank Herbert, Brian Herbert, and Kevin J. Anderson. But one of the things is there's a section that has all the letters between Frank Herbert, Lurton, his Lurton Blasingame, his awesomely named agent. And so they have all these awesome letters, and they're just amazing to read. Especially, like, there's one where he's talking about somebody basically says it's just basically a fantasy, and Herbert gets really pissed about the idea that it's just a fantasy, and explains the science behind the still suit and the water and the ecology, just to say, like, hey, this is really science fiction.
There's a lot of science stuff in there.
Yeah. I'm going to open the floor now. Michael, we haven't heard from you in a little bit. For you, when you first dug into Dune after you read all those other ones, what was it that struck you most about Dune the first time you read it?
So it's like something very personal, like in my life, which is like how I was raised. And I was raised by a single mom, right? And, you know, Dad left at 3, didn't come back. It was, I won't go too much of the history, but yeah, Dad wasn't around, right? And so, like, male and female difference was something on my mind from a very young age. And so, like, in that book, they're talking about subtleties of, like, actions that the average man falls into or the average woman falls into usually in their thinking. And then later, like, all the books that I've read since Frank Herbert have to do with things that Frank Herbert pointed me toward, like neuroscience, psychology, especially evolutionary psychology, right? If you go into God Emperor Dune, he's getting into the chimp cultures and stuff like that. And a lot of this neuroscience, which we can point to nowadays, this stuff is scientific. It's not just like anecdotal anymore. And so what I was seeing in all of his books was like, yeah, like he's really good at pinpointing like how men and women are different. But then like reading Dreamer of Dune later by Brian Herbert, you get to see that his wife was like helping him with plot and like with the motivations of female characters a lot. So I was like, oh, that's how he was able to put that in so well. And there are other things since then. I mean, I could literally go on for 3 hours with that question, to tell you the truth.
Well, we'll get more into that. I know for me personally, now, I'm coming at this perspective right now as I'm doing a Philip K. Dick podcast, so I'm reading a lot of, especially, I'm really into the new wave of science fiction from the 60s. And even though Frank Herbert started to publish in the 60s, he's never been considered a part of the new wave, right? He's always been kind of considered one of the classics, more in line with your Clarks and your Asimovs and your Heinleins, which is really interesting to me because he really, I don't know, he doesn't come off to me so much as a part of that community either. I think he kind of stands apart from the rest of genre fiction because as much as Dune is a science fiction classic, it is not traditional in its own ways. Everything that's tropes about it are mostly things that became tropes because of Dune, right?
Yeah. And just to go on that note, I just remember in Dreamer of Dune, like Brian Herbert talking about his dad was into didactics and teaching lessons to other people. Mm-hmm. And his dad was really into philosophy. And like the William Toupont's version of Frank Herbert goes into the very specifics of which philosophers Frank Herbert was very familiar with and stuff in different works and how he tried to wake up the readers to certain things, just like very Jungian, you know, with his relationship with the Slatterys as friends. But Brian Herbert goes into this thing where it's like his dad did not at first pick science fiction. He did not actually want to do science fiction at first, but then eventually warmed up to it and was like, hey, I could take all these really deep lessons that I have to pass on to other people, and I could use this genre. And then Brian Herbert ends that whole story by saying, like, his dad finally found the right mix of didactics where he's teaching a lesson with entertaining the reader when he got successful.
And he certainly did a good job of doing genre fiction.
Yeah.
And I forgot to tell this story when I should have told this story when I was introducing my relationship with Dune. probably around 2006. My wife and I lived for a year in Western Washington, in the middle of nowhere, in a little town called Port Angeles. And we're both vegan, and we like to shop at. And one of the best health food stores in that area was in a little town called Port Townsend. And we used to shop at the co-op there. And when we'd go to Port Townsend, we would walk around Port Townsend just to get, a little change of pace. And one day I was walking around Port Townsend, and I just happened to go into the library there because I wanted to use the bathroom. And when I walked in, the whole library was Duned out, right? There was Dune displays, and there was there were sandworms painted on the walls, and I was like, well, this is amazing. And I went up to the librarian, and I was like, hey, so this is really cool that you're all Duned out here, but why? Right? And they were like, oh, well, we were Frank Herbert's library when he wrote Dune. He came to this library to do research all the time, and he lived right down the road when he wrote the first version of Dune. And I was like, holy shit, really? Where? Right?
Oh, cool.
And they said, oh yeah, it's this little white house, blah, 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 or I don't remember what color the house, but they told me what to look for, and then I walked over there and got weird looks from the person that lived there now, who had no idea that this classic of the genre was written in the house they were living in, and they were just kind of looking at me like, hey, weirdo, get away from my house. But here's an interesting thing to note about Port Townsend, the place where he was living when he wrote this book. That place is one of the rainiest towns you can ever imagine. So when he's writing about this dry-ass desert place, I just pictured him, taking breaks and going for walks with, a giant rain jacket on, just getting dumped on. Because, and walking to and from this library that was 3 blocks away. And according to the librarians there, he would routinely go and set up at the library and read books on ecology and philosophy and different things that he was making notes for Dune, and that the librarians that worked there at the time, of course, none of which are still there, but had told these legendary stories about Frank Herbert sitting for hours at this table at that library, and that's why the library has become this shrine to Dune, which is just fucking cool.
That's super cool. I can't believe those people that live in that house obviously don't go hang out in that library and
right.
read Dune.
And so just some things that I want to talk about with Dune. One of the things that I think is really cool, and there's such a depth to the history and the timeline of Dune that before you even really get into the novel, I think one of the keys to this, what makes Dune so amazing, is the world building. And the fact that it's really his first attempt at a science fiction novel, it's really incredible how much world building he was able to pack into this novel so effortlessly. And one of the best examples that I think there is in this book is that we only find out that this future, or that this story takes place in our future, from one throwaway line about the Catholic Bible and how it's been translated. Right?
Yep.
And I want to talk a little bit about how the world building affected each of you as a reader, because for me, that is one of the things that obviously, it's not just the timeline, it's the fact that there's a Butlerian jihad that gets kind of mentioned, that it's enough that we understand what happened, that we understand what the Bene Gesserit are. And I think it provided a lesson, obviously, for George Lucas, who was able to, when he made Star Wars, to say, people will follow along. They'll get it. I just say they're Jedis, and eventually people will figure it out. And I think one of the biggest lessons for that was Dune, and the way the world building worked. So, anyways, I just would love to hear your thoughts about how the world building affected you. Starting with Marissa.
I think pretty much exactly what you just said, where there's these little details and things are given, but without all the backstory and without all the information. So when I'm reading it. It's like, yeah, he gives you just enough to be super curious about the rest of this world and who all these different peoples are. And then slowly you get it like little drips all the way through. And I think that's why I really love reading it regularly, because every time I read it, I see some new like detail or some new thing of the world or of the culture that I'm like, what? He put that in there that I didn't even notice it the last time? Like, there's so much in there. It's insane.
And I think that's one of the reasons too that you get a different experience if you listen to it on audio too, which I've also done.
Yeah, me too.
I don't really count that as the time of reading it, but if you count that, then there's a fourth time in there. But I really got a good experience from just sitting down and listening to it, which I'm not a huge audiobook fan, so that means something for me. Michael, how were you a big science fiction reader before you read Herbert, or was this your introduction to the genre?
It was my introduction.
Okay, cool. So in that regard, because I was a big science fiction reader before I read Dune, and so I kind of had a bit of language for world building. But how was the world building for you as a first time science fiction reader? How did the world construct in your mind?
Well, to like take it back to what my thinking was when I was reading it the first time, and like, so I'm going through all of his, not all of his, but like most of his other smaller works. Like you're talking about, this is a big novel, the big one, right? All of these other smaller works aren't really that big compared to it. They're like a third or a fourth, right? So like, I'm taking themes that I've read in these other books, and I'm just comparing to that. And also I'm comparing based on my upbringing, which like looking ahead and like reading all this other stuff about his personal life, it's like, wow, it's not the same exact upbringing, but there are a lot of similarities, right? And it's like the seriousness of his upbringing, his childhood religion, and a lot of the ideas that go into that, like the seriousness of purpose, how to be a good man one day, and all that kind of stuff. But anyways, it's like I'm reading, and I'm always thinking about two things, which is like the Harkonnens and how they're raising this young man up, which is very sinister, very bad, right? And then Paul Atreides and how he's being raised up. And it's like one of them is just animalistic, cannot control his animal instincts. The other one is being taught mental models of self-control, is being taught a lot of deeper stuff, right? And also something that goes back to the Dasadi experiment, where the protagonist, George X. McKee, actually melds his mind with the female protagonist, so they have what's called an androgynous brain. One of the things Frank Herbert talks about in his works is like, you can't be an overly male brain or an overly female brain. You need to find like middle ground. And it's very pertinent in his generation coming up, especially, where you have to say like, you can't be on one side or the other. There are benefits and disadvantages to each. So you got to kind of like come to a middle ground, right? And this young man, he's like taking a lot of direction from his mom. He's willing to accept subtle touch points and things of that nature. And then even when he goes through this trance, and this just like when I read him going through the trance and what he said after the trance when he wakes up, and he's like, all the men failed because they're so used to being taker and they wouldn't humble themselves to be a giver. Whereas so many, he said, the women were givers too much and weren't willing to be takers. So he's found middle ground. So I was always into this, like, there are two young men being raised up, and what are the differences between them? And then like Paul wins in the end, and this other guy who's a real animalistic bad guy gets killed, and it's like, okay, great, beautiful.
I think Dune is a novel that, well, obviously one of the things that makes Dune great is it works on many levels. So we could talk for a long time about specifically Paul Atreides and Muad'Dib and his relationship with the Fremen, or his relationship with Lady Jessica, and there could be a whole podcast on that with his mom and the Harkonnens. But basically, when it comes down to it, I think one of the basic things that Dune is about is systems, and it's ways of thought, and it's how the galaxy as a whole in this saga is affected by the various machinations and politics and systems. And all the characters, what's great about it is all the characters, if you take the minor ones from Duncan, Idaho, to what was the name of the ecologist? Stilgar.
Kind.
Yeah, and so you take all these characters, but it's all in service to the system. And what's really important about why, and this is why John W. Campbell eventually did not publish Dune Messiah, and he had to get another publisher for Dune Messiah, is because John Campbell saw this as like, he wanted the super duper. He made the joke that, maybe a little less super duper, but then Herbert went full no super duper, and he basically made Muad'Dib a failed emperor, right? Basically.
Yep.
And that was the plan all along, because Herbert had all these quotes about that these leaders should come with a warning like, hey, we're not as awesome as you think you are, or as we think we are, right?
Yeah. So at the end, something about like the planet being afflicted by a hero.
Right. And I think it's really interesting because in the end, we can see it through the mirror of our politics, but everything, and you hear a lot about spice is oil, right? That the spice melange and everything that it represents in Dune is this huge analogy for oil, and it's not incorrect, right? But it's just one aspect of it, and I don't think people should read too much into that, because I think the more important thing is the spice is important. It's a MacGuffin for how Muad'Dib is able to gain control over Arrakis, thus, as the way the spice flows, the universe flows. But the important thing, especially when you get deeper into the saga, is how Paul Atreides is a flawed hero. And it subverts the hero's journey. And I think that's one of the reasons why people love the first book and don't really enjoy the other books as much and don't reread them, is because you have this very fulfilling hero's journey in Dune, and then it's not so fulfilling if you read the other parts. But that's what makes the point of it.
Yeah. And it's kind of, you do get that sense at the end of the first book, like you can tell it's all of his efforts to not bring the jihad. It's like, you can tell it's going to fail.
Mm-hmm. And he knows, Paul Atreides knows that it's kind of like, if I don't take part in it, it's going to be even worse, right? So
yeah.
I kind of have to do this. And, we see in some of the, in the parts, and it's been a while since I read Dune Messiah, so you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong about this, Marissa, since you just read it, or reading it now. But when he kind of goes out among the people and is just trying to hear the word on the street, right? And, I think, well, if only we'd have more leaders that would do that. And I definitely think there's still a lot of really ideal things about Paul Atreides. But here's the thing I also wonder about is, I wonder how much the way that Book 2 and Book 3 ended up were a result of John Campbell's letter affecting Herbert, right? Because editors have that impact, even if you don't agree with them, right? And if you're like, well, I'm going to show him or her, right? And they might. I've been wondering if either of you think that Herbert might have been course correcting or overcorrecting in the way that he went further into the story. I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on that. That's just something I've been thinking about since I read that quote.
I do. Marissa, do you have anything?
My only thought is from the impressions that I've gotten of Frank Herbert from bits and pieces I've read, he seems like a pretty strong-willed, solid character. So I feel like he wouldn't be too easily influenced by editors. But yeah, I can't really say.
Yep.
That's true. That's true. Maybe that's so. I know for example with PKD, like we are constantly seeing the give and go with his editors, and you definitely saw, especially in the early days in Philip K. Dick's career, after his first novel Solar Lottery came out, and everyone was like talked about what a left wing book it was, that he
Yeah.
kind of went overboard with the world Jones made to make it look like I am not a left winger.
Yeah. But he's like, I feel like he's super sensitive and easily influenced. Like, I think if someone sneezes, his book would be different.
Right.
Like,
That's true, and so I have to come at this perspective as somebody who's studying Dick, and this project of doing all the Hugo winners is fun for me because I'm getting into the heads of some other writers. But I think one of the fun things about Dune is just that like strong personality does come through. I'm not as well versed in Herbert as you are, Mike, but how much do you think Herbert's personality is a part of Dune? Like,
Okay, so to answer that question, let me just veer off back to that previous one. The two things about like the John Campbell thing, or yeah, I guess it ties in with what we were saying anyways. Yeah, okay, I'm slow. All right, so the first thing is like in that Frank Herbert book by Tim O'Reilly, and Tim O'Reilly did a great job in analyzing Frank Herbert's works. And he didn't analyze God Emperor of Dune and later, because at that time God Emperor of Dune had just come out, but he did a really good job of getting direct quotes from Frank Herbert. So instead of it just being his analysis, it was a mix of his analysis with a whole bunch of quotes from Frank Herbert. One of them was that John Campbell really did not like that Frank Herbert was making him into like an anti-hero, and then if you go back to Dreamer of Dune and link that same exact fact right there, like Brian Herbert is talking about this whole story with John Campbell, where his dad was making changes left and right and had agreed to make it into 3 books, even though he only wanted to do 1 originally, so he was having to extend some parts to do this and that, right, doing all the things that you do to do that kind of thing. And John Campbell was literally telling him, like, no, you're making him into an anti-hero. And Frank Herbert at one point just said, no, that is the point of this. And it goes back to, like, Destination Void, where like Frank Herbert is teaching people you have to think for yourself. Yeah,
Well,
but anyway, yeah, go ahead.
could you imagine if this was all one big book? Oh my God, I'm glad it's
Dude.
3 books. I mean, if it was like the size of The Stand or whatever, I think no one would have finished it. I think, as much as we give some of the editors a hard time when we read these things, and we kind of often. And I, you might feel differently, Marissa, as an editor, but as an author, I sometimes like to side with the authors because I feel for them. But in this case, the editor was definitely correct. This was not one book. This needed to be broken up, and I think Campbell was right on that. I don't think he was right on going too far into the anti-hero thing, but in this case, I don't know.
And may I go back to that question you just asked, though?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry I went off on that, but it's like you were talking about how strong-willed he is, or how much of his voice versus like putting voice there. Those quotes in that Tim O'Reilly book, like I went to read all these other books because I really wanted to kind of try to socioanalyze this guy, if you will. And he, like, that O'Reilly book really hit it on the head, because in the O'Reilly book, it's Frank Herbert himself in these long paragraphs explaining, like, okay, this was me doing this to teach a lesson, but then I put this other character in this place, and I just wanted to put that in. So sometimes it's Frank's voice, sometimes it's really not. Like, for example, Frank literally hated Leto II, but you wouldn't know that unless you read in other sources. And some people online in these articles are like, oh, he wrote a monster, he must be a monster, so it's like that.
Oh, the internet.
Yeah. Well, and I would imagine, when we look into, one of the things that's really interesting to me about this book too is that it holds up in some ways really, really well, because the technology doesn't become dated for the simple fact that it is pretty much outside of the realm of our. It's such a weird future, right? Because it's after the Butlerian Jihad. We don't have thinking machines. The technology, it's so far in the future, you can't really say it can't ever get out of date for technology. Some of the socio-political stuff definitely is a little dated. I think in some ways, well, for one thing, too, is there's lots of cultures represented throughout the Dune books. You'll see aspects of Muslim culture. You see aspects of, and you full on have Jews in space later on in the series. Not quite Mel Brooks style, but like there's literally like tribes of Jews in the future, but there's no Africans. There's no African influence. This is a very white book, in many senses. There's Asian influence. There's all kinds of little things, but there is very little African influence. And for me, that's one part that's hard for me. And then I think, some of the medieval style, like you get a lot of the weapons have this medieval feel, but the whole, I was supposed to bear a male child or a female child to get married to, there's definitely intentional sexism in this society, but I'm wondering how much is intentional versus unintentional and how much is out of date. Do either of you feel that? Because I definitely was kind of cringing through this last read of it that I may not have in earlier times.
I have my opinions on it. Marissa?
Well, for me, I feel like the Bene Gesserit stuff, like, I don't have a problem with it because I think it's supposed to be like that. Like, they're obviously set up to do this, like, weird scheming breeding program, and Jessica is rebelling against it for more emotional reasons or a little bit egotistical, maybe, reasons as well. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I didn't, like, read it as, like, oh, no, what's he putting in here? I was kind of like, it felt intentional to me.
Mm-hmm. Well,
what about you, Michael?
Yeah, I think he was a pretty liberated dude. I mean, he lived in a very progressive part of the country anyways, but yeah. Michael?
So it's kind of like the that Noah Berlotsky thing where he's trying to say that, Paul Atreides is like a Mary Sue kind of thing. And I really thought about that for a while, and I thought about, like, how this guy, Noah Berlotsky, who wrote this article, was, like, backing it up. And I was just like, this doesn't feel right. This is not the Frank Herbert I know. I've read almost every one of his works. I've read so many different books about him by other people. I'm just like, this is not the Frank I know. And then I started thinking about that for a long time. And then I had to come to the realization that, like, in some ways, this guy I really look up to, Frank Herbert, is so intelligent and so progressive, like you're saying. But there are very subtle places here and there where that point can be made. But it's just like Noah didn't know where those points were. So, like, for example, if someone wants to hit at Frank Herbert on the cultural thing and how he's using a very outdated, United States white man's view from, like, a person born in the 1920s, like Frank Herbert was, there are only very few places that can be pointed out because Frank Herbert was not a racist, right? There's no indication of that at all anywhere. But the thing is, it's like some of the outdated ideas. If you look at the green brain, if Noah really wanted to write this article, he could try to go at it from that angle, because the green brain is the only place where there are kind of like generalized statements about different cultures in the world with the races involved, kind of like saying that Chinese people, and he doesn't say it just like this, of course, but the Chinese character is like very calculating and wants to get with a very creative Irish girl who's a redhead, but then there's the chase scene and all that, like a lot of different Frank Herbert stuff. So the outdated, like generalized stuff, they're only in very specific places. Another one is the Jewish thing, but and Michael Weingrad, Dr. Michael Weingrad, was the one who wrote the article on, he didn't like that Frank Herbert used such an outdated view of Jewish people in Chapter House Dune when he was showing those people. But at the same time, it's like, I do agree with Michael Weingrad after thinking about it for a while, like, yes, but at the same time, if you socio-analyze Frank Herbert, which is like seeing him for who he was, who he took himself to be, what kind of lessons he was trying to pass on to his readers, you see that, like, Frank Herbert was trying to pass on a lesson of you can't just take your childhood religion and expect that that's going to have all the answers for you in life no matter what. And like me, for example, I love my childhood religion, has given me many benefits, but there are certain lessons that cannot be taught to me or learned just from that. I have to branch out, I have to live my own life, I have to experience other things and learn from other socio-cultural systems as well, and not just say that like and it all goes back to Frank Herbert's life and Dreamer of Dune. Any of these people who want to write on Frank Herbert, if they haven't read Dreamer of Dune, they can't speak to it at all. Like the evil lady thing, that is straight his mother-in-law in his first marriage. But you wouldn't know that unless you read the stuff.
Well, we see that all the time. We see it all the time with Philip K. Dick. I mean, we have a running joke about on our show about how we need a Philip K. Dick Divorcepedia, so to make sure that we know exactly who he had recently divorced from when he wrote said book, because this character obviously is modeled after Anne or Tessa or whoever he was married to at that time. And definitely I think with Herbert, just like anybody else, he's going to be influenced by the things that are going on around him in his world. And, we're not going to begrudge a guy for that. I mean, I think Dune is far from perfect, but considering that it was written or conceived in the 50s, written in the early 60s, it holds up amazingly well, far better, I would say, than, for example, the early Foundation novels.
Dude, Frank Herbert is awesome, period.
Well, I know you feel that way.
Yeah,
I might not be as big of a fan of Herbert as you are, but that's okay. I do a Philip K. Dick podcast, right?
Yeah.
But, I definitely think Herbert is a good author. I don't, especially if you get later in the series, I think books 1 through 3 are fantastic of Dune. 4 and 5 are kind of wacky, and I'm not kind of sure where he was going with that. And I would recommend 1 through 3 to anybody. 4 through 5 I recommend for completionists. And I'm not I'm kind of getting ahead on things, and I am not a fan of the Kevin J. Anderson, Brian Herbert prequels, which I think
Is anyone?
is anyone? Yeah, I don't know.
I've never heard anyone. I'm always asking people, should I read the sequels and stuff, and I've never found anyone recommending those yet.
Well, I will tell you that they have a separate series called Hellhole, and I read the first book of that, and I didn't think I thought it was good. But I was not down for those Dune prequels. I bought the first one when it came out, and I was excited, and I just no. I think that it doesn't have the panache, it doesn't have the world building, it's overthought, and I don't think that it works on any level. But I want to get, we're starting to get to close to an hour, and I want to get into some general themes and talk about some of the parts in the book and just what you guys think about those individual parts. First of all, fear is the mind killer. This is obviously one of the most, quotable parts of Dune. It's one of the parts that's like a huge part of the movies and everything. How does the whole concept of fear is the mind killer and how it threads through the novel? Like, I personally love that part of it. I don't know. Does it have as big of an impact on you two as readers?
Yes.
That whole aspect. I'm sorry, that's kind of a bad question. Marissa?
Yeah, you mean the philosophy of the fear is the mind killer as a practice? Totally. I feel like even use it sometimes, but then I get embarrassed at myself for being such a dork. But I totally would think it and use it sometimes to be calm down.
Yeah, right. I think, I don't know. I mean, I've always loved that part, and although when I hear it out loud in some of the adaptations, it sounds a little cheesy to me, but
Exactly.
but I try to remember how I felt the first time I read that, when it didn't sound so cheesy to me.
That's exactly what I'm saying. It sounds cheesy in my head when I think about it too, but I still love it. I'm like, it's so good.
Right. And how about So no, we haven't really talked about like the actual ecology and the way that Arrakis works as a setting. I've always loved all the aspects that from the sandworms to the Fremen to I think all those aspects. I know we kind of talked about the world building, but I think Herbert did such a good job of making this world, this setting forward the narrative. As a writer, I really appreciated that all the stuff is there for a reason. And I don't know how you guys felt about, because the sandworms kind of get, that can look cheesy too when you're like having the picture of Paul Atreides with two giant chains, like riding on the back of a giant sandworm.
No, it's not cheesy. That's awesome.
Right. But I'm a guy who generally likes like mindfuck science fiction and less of the like super crazy like slay your dragon fantasy stuff. And so I think some of the sandworm stuff doesn't hold up for me quite as well as it used to. But I think what's cool about it is that Paul Atreides is, I mean, all the Fremen, they ride the sandworms, and that's like the whole part of the thing. But I think it's a good analogy for him, like kind of like, it sounds so cheesy to say, but like getting on the horse, right? And for taking the reins of this society and doing that I think that's what's so important about those parts, because it also ties into the whole like fear is the mind killer, because that's where you really see him taking a bold leap and jumping on the back of this giant sandworm and doing that.
I mean, it's the moment he becomes a Fremen, right? Like, that's like he goes through that childhood initiation that I think they say the kids do it at like 6 or something, or
right,
riding the worms.
And and I got to ask you too about this, Marissa. As an editor, how does it make you feel when you read this book when the narrative jumps around like it does? Because he breaks a lot of rules, right?
Well, actually, for me, I think he's the one I point to when I tell people don't try to do this point of view switching thing, but I feel like he pulls it off. Like,
right.
There's only like, there was one place where I got confused about the point of view for a second. Like, the way he cues it and just like smoothly transitions, and you always know exactly whose head you're in. I mean, maybe you guys have a different experience, but I thought it was smooth.
Yep.
Right, and that's the hard thing is like, that is totally against the rules, right?
It's against the rules because it's so hard to do. Like, I think it's not that it's against the rules as much as if anyone that's not a genius tries to do it, it's a spectacular, horrible mess.
Right.
I really liked how William Touponce, who is like literature, right? He was able to break down the banquet scene and then show that Frank Herbert does this all the time, which is where he uses direct, indirect, and semi-direct discourse in the same way that Gustave Flaubert did in Madame Bovary. And when he broke that down, I was like, oh, wow. And then he's like, yeah, these places where Frank Herbert uses like that part of the paragraph where it's like in italics, and those are the deepest thoughts of the people. That's the part where Frank Herbert is directly trying to talk to the reader, just like our minds work on a daily basis, like those little whispers of like, warnings of this or that kind of thing.
Right.
It's so good. This is actually going like way back to the start of the podcast when you were saying like what attracted us to it when we first read it. That was the thing when I was a kid, reading those lines of the inner dialogue and being like, this is how adults think? What? Like, it just felt so real, and so like I had an insight into how grown-ups were thinking about the world.
So one thing that I wanted to kind of bring up, unless anybody has anything else on the narrative structure, anything?
There's something I think is really cool about that narrative structure that we should mention is how what Irulan is doing is giving us that little bit of prescience as we're reading. So like these little like spoilers and clues so that we're kind of seeing the story like Paul sees his unfolding future.
Because he's getting that gift of being able to see into the future. At that
Yeah, and like so, and it's sort of like that same vague thing where she's her own personality. We don't really know who she is or who's writing this or why, but she's just dropping in these little details about what happens in the future and what happens to the storyline. It's like the most spoilery book ever. I think that's another reason why I love it. Like he's not afraid of being like, and this is what's going to happen soon.
And I wonder too, like, you gotta imagine Frank Herbert sitting in that house in Port Townsend, Washington, being like, fuck, I got this great book, man. This is incredible. And like,
Yeah.
and then I'm wondering when he got done with it and he starts sending it out and he has to get it published by an automotive manual publisher. It's like, shit, they really didn't get it.
I mean, that's why every time I read it, I have that feeling. I'm like, how did he make this thing? It's so good. It's so insane. It's so detailed. And then, yeah, to stick through like that and not get disheartened with all those rejections is amazing.
He had to. Go ahead, Mike.
I will say, but I'm very long-winded, unfortunately, so I won't go all down that road. But I will just say, many of the same exact things he's doing in these smaller works before he made Dune, you can see 100% in Dune. So when you're talking about, like, do we see things later on? It's like, oh yeah, we see the Jungian awakening, just like in Under Pressure, and he keeps doing this stuff where it's like he gives you enough hints to just about see what's going to happen. And then the boom comes, and it's like an awakening to the reader. And he uses that same stuff in all these other books. It's really cool.
Cool.
Oh, yeah.
I gotta read his other stuff.
Oh, yeah. Real good.
I have read, was it the Lazarus
Effect?
Yeah, the Lazarus Effect I read many, many, many years ago. And when I'm talking, I mean, I was reading these in the 90s. So I read a couple other Herbert works, but it was like so long ago. They kind of all bleed together, but it was the late 80s, early 90s when I read the whole thing from beginning to end, and then I really had to force myself to read 4 and 5 again when I reread it, but I definitely loved through book 3. But kind of getting ahead of myself here. But how do you guys feel about any of the adaptations? Any opinions on David Lynch's film versus? I know you said, Mike, that you saw the Sci-Fi Channel miniseries first.
I love it. And so did, yeah. And Brian Herbert loved that one the best.
Yeah. I just finished last night rewatching all the way through Children of Dune. And I personally do. I know a lot of people. The problem with here's my feeling on the Sci-Fi Channel miniseries is the David Lynch movie looks awesome, but it doesn't tell the story right well or whatever,
Yep.
you know? And it looks cool, but David Lynch was absolutely the wrong person to make a Dune movie. Who the hell greenlit the idea of the guy who eventually made Mulholland Drive making Dune? I don't know.
Brian Herbert said the same thing in his book. He said, like, that was his movie. It was not my father's stuff. I was like, oh, wow. Okay.
Well, that's... authors feel that way pretty commonly. It's not the worst adaptation I've ever seen of a book that I love.
I liked it personally.
Oh, really? Yeah. I didn't, but... I mean,
I enjoyed it for what it is. Like, it is a treasure, but I don't know exactly what it is. It's
I will say the single worst adaptation of a novel I've ever seen that I liked was Michael Mann, who's a great filmmaker, made a version of The Keep, F. Paul Wilson's horror novel, The Keep. That has to be the single worst translation of a novel I've ever seen.
Really?
Of anything ever. It's a terrible movie, but it's worth seeing if you've read the book, just to be like, wow, what the fuck were they thinking?
I'm gonna read the book and watch the film just for that experience.
Yeah.
So does the Children of Dune miniseries or series, whatever it is, does that cover the first Dune book as well, or is it just the two?
The first miniseries covers the first book, and then the second miniseries covers Dune Messiah and Children of Dune.
Ah, okay.
So when you finish reading those, then you can watch it. But And I do think they are pretty decent adaptations, and I enjoyed watching it for what it is. And I definitely wanted to watch it one more time before Denis Villeneuve, I predict, is going to knock it out of the park next year. And this coming from, because I'm a huge fan of Denis Villeneuve and everything that he's done from Arrival, and I love Blade Runner 2049.
It was good.
Me too.
And I think he is just going to do an awesome job. And on the day that we recorded this, I just went to see Dr. Sleep last night. And Rebecca Ferguson is fucking amazing in Dr. Sleep. And the fact that she's playing Lady Jessica just is awesome. All the casting so far that I've seen for this Denis Villeneuve version of Dune looks amazing.
Yeah, he's making 2 movies, right?
2 movies, and they're doing a Bene Gesserit TV series for
Yes.
Amazon.
I don't know, you guys. Do you feel like I feel like it's going to change? If this is good, it's going to change science fiction fantasy world. So many people haven't read this book or know about it.
Well, and that's the thing, is it's one of the most well-read science fiction novels of all time, but it still is not mainstream, and I think a movie like this could do that.
Yeah. Yeah, the pop culture world, it could get really shaken up if this is good.
Yeah, what we have to hope for is that it hits like a Lord of the Rings. I'm a little worried that, Blade Runner 2049 underwhelmed at the box office, and my concern is that if it takes a little while for the word of mouth to spread, it could hurt the changing of everything. But I hope you're right, Marissa. I hope it does.
Yeah, I was trying to imagine it, and I was like, maybe there's going to be a time where it's like Halloween and like everyone's just in still suits and robes and
People are cosplaying as Dune. Well, and they're pretty confident in it if they're going to go ahead and do a TV series as well.
which is a great idea, by the way. Like the Bene Gesserit story, I was totally thinking I would love to watch a TV show about that. Like that goes really into the characters and spends time in that culture.
Now, and if you look at the interviews that the writers that are working on the staff of that show have given, they're excited because they're all, a couple of them are Dune nerds, and what they're excited about is they get to tell original stories set in this universe, but they are doing lip service to saying that they are following the general mythology, and I do know that Denis Villeneuve is overseen as a producer, so they want it to be one all-consistent universe. And if we're getting a TV series and a movie of Dune, it's really important, though, that Dune fans, really help spread the word for this, because we want it to do well.
Yeah. How do you feel about it, Mike?
Well, it depends where it goes, because a lot of times there is this pattern where people try to make people marvel instead of think.
Yeah, good point.
And going on to read all the different things that I have for the rest of my life, and then going back to Dune and holy crap, I cannot believe he was saying this stuff in the 1960s, 1970s, all the books he wrote. And then you get the message of the stuff, and it's always just trying to marvel, a typical scene in a movie where it's and then where's the deep thinking? And the thing is that story behind stuff. If you go on to read, I'm not a Jungian psychologist or anything, right? My wife has an actual psychology degree, so when I talk about psychology with her, she's like, Michael, where'd you read this, right? But I've read 3 Jung books, right? And it's just going back to Frank Herbert, and it's just I cannot believe all the stuff that is in Frank Herbert. He's trying to awaken the readers to certain things. And then when you look at other books quoting Frank, he was literally trying to wake up people to certain ways of thinking. And all of his works are like that, which I know I'm going against the grain here, but my favorite works are 5 and 6, because that semester on Michel de Montaigne, that philosopher, going through a reflexive discourse, and then the really deep touch point that he has to say, it comes and goes before you even notice it, because, but anyways, look, we can talk about that another time. But with the movie, I just really hope that they put some actual deep thinking in a way that's portrayed on the screen to the people to think, but I don't even know how you do that.
Yeah, I was just thinking, That sounds like a brilliant idea, and then I'm trying to think if I've ever seen that executed, because I think TV is not good at that.
No.
Well, I would say that Denis Villeneuve is as good a chance that we have to get
Yeah,
that.
that's true.
So, Marissa, I'd like to know before I get our final thoughts on this book, how has, since this was an early one for you, and you mentioned a little bit that you use examples from Dune, do you, as an editor, how do you feel that Dune is still influencing how you work with other authors today? Does it still has an impact, I imagine, like specifically this book on your
Yeah.
career?
Did you say how is it affecting how I work with authors?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, definitely like what you just said, the point of view stuff and the characterization. I'll definitely use that. Like I'll point to examples in Dune for that because he's just such a master of it.
Hmm.
And
Do you ever tell writers that just go read Dune? Like, is that
um,
one of the ones, one of the books that you?
I actually haven't really, but only because I would have to be working with someone who's writing a book, trying to do something similar, and I don't think I've
Right.
really had an author like that yet, but I totally would if I was working with anyone who was doing like I don't know, writing about ecology or that kind of science fiction or multi-point of view, if they were actually going to attempt it, I would definitely tell them to read it.
Hmm. All right. So, final thoughts. I'm gonna. Of course, this is to me and the way we always rate things on the podcast. This would be 5 still suits out of 5 for me. Um, of course, I don't think it's absolutely perfect. I'm not super like I. Frank Herbert is definitely not totally my jam. I have read some of the other works and they just haven't caught to me, and he doesn't speak to me in the same way that Philip K. Dick does, for example. But that's why I do a Philip K. Dick podcast. But I definitely think Dune is, my first take when I first finished this, for those who follow me on Facebook, was to be like, hey, hot take, guys, Dune is good. you know,
Yeah.
there's a reason people like this fucking book. I mean, it's really good. And the funny thing was that I have to admit that for this Hugo series, when I looked at all the books I was going to have to read for this series, my first thought was, oh shit, I got to read Dune again. Oh shit. And I liked it a lot more reading it this time than I expected to. And
Yeah, this was my favorite read of it. So I feel like every time I read it, I'm like, that was even better than the last time.
so Marissa, I mean, it's 5 out of 5 for you, right? I'm assuming.
Yeah, yeah, I'll give it 5 out of 5 little drowned makers.
Okay, and Mike, I'm assuming.
You know.
I don't even have to ask, do I? All right. Well, yeah, Dune is a classic for a reason, and I don't think anyone's gonna ever argue that. I don't think anyone who's a serious science fiction reader is ever gonna argue against Dune. Mike, what are you hoping that a new reader to Dune or new readers coming to it because of the movie will get out of Dune?
Well, just going back to Dreamer of Dune, I picked up that this might be what he was doing from his works because it affected me so much. But like Brian Herbert just hit it right on the head when he was introduced to the Slatteries, who were students of Carl Jung over in Switzerland, and he even set up his own practice for a while. Frank Herbert did, and it's like one of the things Jung had as a mission was curing neuroses, which he called psychic infection, which is like superstitious crap that all of us believe, cliches we fall into and stuff like that, patterns from our parents and grandparents. And for the rest of his life, you can see that Frank Herbert was thinking very deeply based on his past experience. And that's why he talks about philosophical musing all the time in his works, especially Duncan in 5 and 6, right? And it's all I want to see is more neuroses to be cured and more people's lives to become better because they read this stuff.
And Marissa, what do you hope? What's your hope for the new readers that come to Dune because of the Denis Villeneuve movie?
I was just trying to think about that, and can I say everything? Because I think he does everything in there so well, like the world building, the characters, the motivations of characters, and the backstory, and the dialogue, and territorial sandworms. You can put that into any book, and I'll read it.
All right, Herberters. I had fun talking about Dune. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.
Oh, yes.
And keep it paranoid. Stay paranoid.